History likes to pretend it remembers everything. It builds statues for kings, praises the victors, and repeats the same familiar names until they become truth. We think we know how England began, the Angles to the north, the Saxons sweeping in from the east, and a land caught between old Rome and new warriors. It's a story that feels settled, complete, until you notice what's missing. There was once another people, a nation not of myth, but of memory buried deep. They ruled, they built, they wrote the first English laws and helped decide the fate of Britain. Yet their name has nearly disappeared from the narrative. They were the Jutes, also called the Jutes, a Germanic people whose fingerprints still shape the English world, even if their name does not. Most of us have never been told about them, and that silence is not an accident. The chroniclers of the early Middle Ages wrote from the perspective of the powerful, and over time power shifted away from the Jutes. As kingdoms fell and history was rewritten, the Jutes slowly faded from the story they once helped lead. But the soil has a memory, and archaeology has begun to speak for them again. Let's go back, long before England, to the Jutland Peninsula, a place where icy winds sweep across dark forests and the sea bites at the coastline with restless hunger. This is where the Jutes first rose, in the early centuries after the birth of Christ. They were not a loose scattering of tribes, they were communities with purpose, bound together by kinship and the stern demands of their land. Their lives centered around longhouses, enormous timber structures that stretched across the earth like grounded ships. Inside, multiple generations lived together. Warriors, mothers, children, elders, sometimes even livestock, sharing the warmth of the central hearth. A longhouse wasn't just a home. It was identity, protection, and the root of every decision that shaped their society. Within those walls, stories were told under firelight, and loyalties were forged that would one day guide them across the sea. They were skilled people, resourceful and inventive. They mined bog iron from marshes and transformed it into blades and tools with remarkable finesse. Their pottery was unlike neighboring tribes. Sharp-rimmed, decorated with angular patterns that symbolized a visual style all their own. Their artisans crafted ornate brooches and fibulae with spiraling metal work that archaeologists now recognize as an early spark of the art that would blossom across Anglo-Saxon England. They were not isolated. From coastal settlements, Jutish traders sent amber, fur, and iron along routes stretching all the way to the Roman Empire. Roman coins made their way into Jutish graves. Glass cups, never made in the north, appear buried with Jutish nobles. These objects tell a quiet truth. Rome saw value in the Jutes, and the Jutes saw opportunity in Rome. Wealth changed them. Prestige, goods created elites, warrior chiefs with both the authority of ancestry and the power of trade. They became protectors and rulers, commanding loyalty and building alliances. But power always invites conflict, and the world around them was changing. Populations were rising, resources strained, rival tribes pressed against their borders. And across the sea, an entire province was unraveling. Roman Britain, once mighty and disciplined, had begun to collapse. When legions withdrew in the early 400s, local rulers were left exposed. Enemies pushed from every direction. They needed allies, and desperation makes strange bargains. The Britons called across the sea for help. And answering that call were warriors from Jutland, Jutes who saw not just battle, but a land of promise. At first, only fighters arrived, young men testing the ground, learning the weaknesses of this foreign island. Their names echo through half-mythical history: Hengist and Horsa. Whether they were real brothers or symbols of many leaders acting in unison, they represent the moment the Jutes stepped into British affairs. Their battles were effective, their reputations spread, and soon they were joined by more than soldiers. Entire families set sail, people bringing children, livestock, tools, and memories of the homeland they might never see again. Crossing the North Sea was not a simple voyage. It required knowledge of winds and tides and a trust in ships built with the precision of survival. But the Jutes were not strangers to the sea. It had shaped them since the beginning. It would now deliver them to a new destiny. They landed in southeastern Britain, a place that would soon be known as Kent. The land was fertile, the rivers made trade easy, and the coasts allowed them to stay connected with the world they came from. Here, the Jutes did not merely settle, they transformed. British estates influenced by Rome were still standing. Stone foundations, tile roofs, organized farmlands. The Jutes adopted what was useful, ignored what wasn't, and built something new. This would become the first true English kingdom. The Jutish rulers of Kent organized law and justice in a way Britain had never seen before. About the year 597, King Ethelbert ordered those laws, based on Jutish custom and reinforced by rising Christian influence, to be written down. This was the first written law code in the English language, a momentous step, a foundation of English identity, and yet today the Jutes, are almost an afterthought. Most modern histories recite the same pattern: Angles and Saxons, and a footnote about Jutes. But what if the story has been written wrong? What if the Jutes were not the third people, but the first? As centuries passed, power shifted. Mercian kings grew strong. The West Saxons rose higher. Borders changed. The Isle of Wight, once Judish, fell. Hampshire's Judish communities blended into larger Anglo-Saxon politics. And as names changed, chroniclers rearranged the past in service of the present. The Jutes lost their spotlight, not because they failed, but because their successes were absorbed by others. Yet their legacy remains. It remains in the language of law, in the early architecture of churches, in brooches discovered under farm soil, in DNA extracted from ancient bones, in the name of Canterbury, once their royal heart, in the silence between the lines of history books. Tonight, as your mind slows and the world softens into rest, we will awaken a forgotten chapter. We will follow these people from wind-swept Denmark to the halls of Kentish kings. We will watch them rise, struggle, influence, and almost vanish. But the earth is remembering, and we will remember with it. The Jutes are returning to their place in the story, a story that begins in the firelit halls of Jutland and leads to the birth of a kingdom we still call England. Sleep now as we turn the page. Their journey is over. Wind, wood, and war. The wind in Jutland has a voice. It howls across the open plains in winter, lashes the coasts in storms, and whispers through the dark northern forests, even in summer calm. It shapes everyone who lives under its rule. Tonight, we remain for a while in that landscape, the original homeland of the Jutes, to understand the world that formed them long before they ever dreamed of kingship in Britain. Imagine waking each morning in a land where the horizon feels endless and the sky has the mood of an ancient god, unpredictable, powerful, quick to turn. A single hall stands against it all, long and low, smoke curling from a central fire that never sleeps. These long houses are more than wood and clay. They are shelters against nature and time itself, stretching 20 or 30 meters across the earth. Within those walls, life is never truly separate. Generations live together, newborns resting in wool, warriors sharpening iron near the door, elders telling stories that keep the dead alive. The cattle and sheep, too, are part of the family, tucked inside when winter becomes merciless. Each longhouse is home to a clan, a bloodline. And across that landscape, many clans form a community, a people who share not only survival, but pride. The Jutes were organized by kinship first and politics second. Loyalty was personal, not to a state or a symbol, but to the hall where you were born, and to the chieftain whose ancestors could be traced back through memory and myth. A leader's feast was his proof of power, food for the hungry, gifts for the loyal, and protection for those who depended on his spear arm. A bad leader was forgotten. A great one lived forever in the stories told beside the hearth. From the very beginning, the Jutes carried fire in their hands, fire used to transform raw earth into iron. Northern marshes held ancient ore beneath the peat. The Jutes dug it out, dried it, and fed it into the furnace. They became experts in coaxing metal from mud, and from that metal came tools for building and weapons for defending. Iron meant independence. It meant authority. It meant that no Roman legion or Saxon neighbour could easily push them aside. Archaeologists, those quiet detectives of forgotten lives, have discovered the remains of these iron workshops in old Judish heartlands. They've found slag heaps, broken blades, and the ghostly silhouettes of furnaces that once glowed with molten power. Each artifact tells the same truth. The Jutes were not primitive. They were skilled, resourceful, and adaptable. Their pottery wasn't crude either. With sharp rims and geometric patterns carved or pressed into clay, their designs carried a visual language that set them apart from other tribes. They decorated daily life, bowls, cups, storage jars, with symbols that echoed their sense of identity. Look closely at those patterns and you can almost see the rhythm of their world. Strong lines, precise shapes, order, and function. But it wasn't only craft that shaped them, it was contact, unexpected, distant contact, with the giant superpower of the ancient world. The Roman Empire, vast and hungry for resources, saw value in what the Jutes could offer: amber that gleamed like trapped sunlight, strong metal tools, sturdy fabrics. Roman merchants didn't sail with armies, they sailed with silver and glass. And these treasures found their way into Judish burials, buried with warriors who likely never saw a Roman city, but held in their hands proof that their people mattered beyond the horizon. This trade didn't soften the Jutes, it hardened their ambitions. When a chieftain was buried with Roman glass, polished brooches and fine weapons, it told the living something important. We can grow, we can rise. The world beyond the sea knows our name. But rising meant competition. Saxons to the south pulled from the same resources, Angles to the east pushed for more land. And within Jutland itself, rival clans tested one another in cold fog and early morning raids. Life was a negotiation with nature and neighbours alike. And above all, hovered a tension that no weapon could defeat: the climate. The 4th and 5th centuries brought colder weather, poorer harvests, and a pressure that weighed upon every family and every chieftain's decisions. A leader who failed to feed his people lost honour. A people who could not grow risked extinction. It was in this crucible, iron beneath their feet, trade at their shores, and uncertainty in the air, that the Jutes became a people of bold choices. They looked beyond their homeland and wondered what lay across the sea. Across that water, Britain shimmered like a promised land. Warmer climate, fertile fields, and rich towns weakened after Rome withdrew her legions. Word of opportunity sailed back with every returning boat. Perhaps the villages talked of Britain the way dreamers describe a future they haven't yet touched. A land where chiefs may become kings, a place where longhouses could become halls of power, ground that will feed every child born beneath a Judish roof. The sea, once a boundary, now looked like a path, and so preparation began. Tools were packed, livestock gathered, warriors sharpened their swords anew. But alongside them, mothers swaddled infants, elders saved heirlooms, and artisans wrapped their tools. For what they carried was not just belongings, but identity. They were not simply leaving home, they were preparing to rebuild it somewhere else. And when the time came, when ships met the tide, when leaders spoke of destiny, longhouses would empty quietly at dawn. Those who remained watched the sails stretch like wings against endless grey skies. Hearts broke, hearts hoped, because those departing were not abandoning the Jutes, they were carrying the Jutes into the future. This is the moment where migration becomes more than movement. It becomes meaning. The people who mastered fire from the earth, who held back the cold with timber and courage, now turned toward the unknown, guided by ambition older than any kingdom. They believed the gods who rode the wind would not lead them into darkness. The sea would test them, but also deliver them. Soon the story will shift across the waves to a land divided and starving for strong hands, a land that would not only welcome the Jutes, but let them rule. Their new world was the crossing. The sea is a boundary for some people. For the Jutes, it was a promise. As the 5th century unfolded, the fires in Judish halls burned lower. Each year the winters seemed longer, the harvests shorter, and the rivalries sharper. Stories of Britain spread like sparks, fertile lands, weakened rulers, a place where ambitious chiefs could carve new destiny. And so plans were made, not in wild haste, but in slow, deliberate decisions whispered across council circles and sealed by oath. The ships they built were not the tall-masted vessels of later Norse fame. They were lower to the water, wide-bellied, crafted from carefully split oak. Hull planks overlapped like scales, tar-sealed to face the violent moods of the North Sea. These ships were extensions of the Longhouse, built by the same hands, held together by trust and the need to survive. When a migration begins, it is not only warriors who choose to leave, it is the mother who packs grain and heirloom beads into a chest, hoping the gods will allow her children to see a future. It is the elder who struggles to step onto the deck, carrying memories of ancestors buried in cold soil that will soon lie far behind. It is the craftsman who wraps his iron tools in leather, knowing he will build the first shelters of a new world. Night comes. The final offerings are given. Bread to the sea, iron to the fire, a whispered prayer to the unseen powers that control wind and tide. The horizon holds no shape, only darkness. Yet hope pushes the boats from the shore. The sea responds the way it always does, with indifference. Waves rise, salt stings. The hull creaks under stress. Fear sits beside determination. Many cannot sleep, staring into the black void where water blends into sky, listening to warriors hum, old songs of courage meant to keep terror silent. But dawn eventually comes. Grey light reveals the endless rhythm of waves, and with it, the truth. The Jutes are now between worlds. Jutland grows distant. Britain has not yet appeared. A strange kind of freedom lives in that space, a moment where everything they have ever known is behind them, and everything they will become is ahead. Days pass, some fall ill, others grow restless. Children cling to mothers as the rocking deck becomes their cradle. The leaders stand watch, gripping the wood rails as if holding the future steady. Then, on a morning wrapped in fog, the first dark silhouette rises from the sea. Land, Britain. They steer toward a shore not yet marked on their maps, but deeply carved into their ambition. The ships slide onto pebbled beaches, warriors leap into knee-deep surf, and voices crack with shouts of victory, not the victory of battle, but of arrival. They carry their gods ashore first, then the children, then everything else. The land beneath their feet feels different, softer, warmer, more forgiving. Nearby fields show signs of cultivation. Britain is wounded but still alive. Smoke rises from distant villages, Roman and British mixed together in fading patterns of empire. The Jutes know they are not the first to arrive. Angles and Saxons have landed elsewhere. But here, in the southeast, a unique bargain waits. Local kings, Romanized but desperate, approach with suspicion and need tightly interwoven. They have heard of these northerners, of their fierce discipline in war. They offer something bold, land, food, silver, if the Jutes will fight for them against hostile neighbors. War as a contract, settlement in exchange for security. Leadership among the Jutes is clear. Hengist and Horsa, a pair of brothers in legend, or perhaps figureheads representing a coalition of chieftains, step forward. Whether they were real blood or symbolic unifiers, history will always debate. But in this moment, they are the sharp edge of Judish destiny. The first battles are swift and brutal. Judish spears and pattern-welded swords clash with shields stamped from older traditions. The Britons watch the newcomers fight with silent awe. They expected mercenaries. What they see are warriors who fight like people defending their own ground, not foreign land. Victory reshapes the balance of power. The Britons fulfill their promise. Kent opens its fields. The Jutes take root. Soon, more ships arrive. News travels back across the sea that Britain is not a temporary refuge. It is the future. Entire communities follow, bringing with them the customs of the homeland. Longhouses rebuilt in new soil, burial rites practiced beside strange rivers, and pottery decorated with the same geometric confidence as in Jutland. Some Britons welcome them, seeing in the Jutes the protection Rome no longer gives. Others resent them, calling them occupiers. But fear cannot push them back to the sea. They are too committed now. Their children are being born in Britain, and a people belongs to the ground that cradles its young. Conflict is inevitable. Tensions rise. The line between ally and ruler blurs. When warriors defend land long enough, the land becomes theirs. The Jutes negotiate, threaten, and maneuver with the same strategy that once helped them survive the cold north. In quiet conversations held after feasts, in messages sent through interpreters, in marriages that bind families across cultures, the Jutes tighten their grip. Hengist, or the man symbolized by that name, understands something crucial. Power is not granted. It is taken slowly, so those losing it do not notice until it is gone. Kent becomes Judish. Their halls rise taller. Their fields stretch farther. Their weapons grow more refined, their alliances more dangerous. They are no longer foreign helpers. They are a new ruling power, the first since Rome's shadow faded. And through all of this, the sea remains their lifeline. They trade with the Franks. They call for more kin from the homeland. Their ships come and go like messengers of fate. Britain is beginning to reshape them, yes, but they are also reshaping Britain. No historian standing in the court of Kent could yet see what this truly meant. But archaeology will, law codes will, DNA will. The echoes of this moment will vibrate through English identity long after the Jutes lose their name. For now, the sands of Kent show the footprints of a people who believe destiny has finally welcomed them ashore. Their story has crossed the water. Their kingdom is beginning. A kingdom born of two worlds did not arrive in an empty land. Britain had been a Roman province for nearly 400 years. and traces of that empire still clung to the earth like the remnants of a dream that refuses to die. Crumbling villas stood among fields, fragments of mosaics slept beneath overgrown grass, and roads straightened the land as if geometry itself had been laid into the soil. Though the legions had gone, Rome's memory lingered in Britain's bones. The Jutes stepped into this world not as destroyers but as opportunists with vision. They recognized the power in what Rome had left behind, a system of wealth, farming, and administration that could serve new rulers if used wisely. While some Germanic settlers elsewhere tore down Roman walls or ignored them entirely, the Jutes did something far more strategic. They fused what they brought with what they found. Kent became their proving ground. In the earliest years, the Jutes lived beside Britons instead of apart from them. Marketplaces brought them together. Intermarriage created bridges between cultures. Some Britons adopted the newcomers' styles of dress or weaponry. Some Jutes learned to speak a bit of Latin left behind by centuries of Roman trade. They exchanged more than goods. They exchanged identity. Diplomacy was their first weapon, not the sword. The Britons initially offered land in exchange for defense, but as the Jutes proved themselves both capable and ambitious, the balance of power gradually tilted. Those who had once been guests became advisors, protectors, partners, and eventually rulers. Without realizing it, Britain's local leaders handed authority to those who could hold it, the Jutes. Hengist's Hall in Kent became a symbol of this transfer. It wasn't merely a home, it was a statement, a center of decision-making where judgments were spoken aloud and feasts confirmed alliances. Inside, Britons seeking protection might sit beside Judish warriors, sharing bread, while silently calculating what that protection cost. Soon the Jutes held not only military strength, but agricultural and commercial control. Roman trade routes across the Channel reopened, not under imperial command this time, but under Judish initiative. Ships brought goods from the Frankish realms of Gaul. Canterbury's port towns buzzed with life. Wealth flowed not toward Rome, but toward the Jutes. What makes their rise remarkable is that Kent quickly became the most sophisticated of the emerging post-Roman kingdoms in Britain. Their political organization was clearer, their laws more advanced, their rulers more internationally connected. They did not simply replicate Jutland, they improved upon it. Part of that improvement came from adopting useful Roman concepts. Clearer land ownership, weighted compensation in justice, administrative record-keeping, diplomatic hierarchy. But none of these existed in a vacuum. They blended with a tribal social structure that still honored kinship, clan loyalty, and ritual feasting. The result was a hybrid power system, not Roman, not pagan, purely Germanic, but Kentish, Judish, something new that no historian has fully captured. And it worked. Judish leaders realized that knowledge was as powerful as war. They learned from the defeated empire rather than letting pride blind them. Their early rulers saw that authority could come from the sword in one hand and law in the other. It was only a matter of time before their influence reached beyond borders. But as Kent grew stronger, jealous eyes watched. Other Germanic groups, Saxons and Angles, resented sharing the prize of Britain. Britain, still resisting change, plotted rebellion. The land was shifting, unpredictable, promising, dangerous. For now, however, the Jutes had succeeded at the first step. They had turned a foothold into a kingdom. Their halls echoed with confidence. Their warriors boasted of the land they now called theirs. Their children grew up speaking a new language. Still of the north, but softened by British tongues, a new world was being woven together, and the Jutes believed their greatness had only just begun. But in history, Every rise prepares the stage for a turning point, the moment when a kingdom must decide what kind of power it truly wishes to be. The next choice would change everything, the choice of faith. Tonight, the kingdom of Kent stands tall in the moonlight, unaware of the transformation about to sweep across it like a divine tide. The gods of the Jutes were listening, and so was the Christian God, waiting quietly to enter their halls. The next chapter begins with a bishop stepping ashore, and a king, the hall of the first English laws. There is a moment in history when a kingdom proves it is no longer temporary, when authority transforms from strong arms to strong institutions, when a ruler decides that power must survive beyond his lifetime through rules that outlive swords. For the Jutes, that moment arrived on a quiet day in Canterbury, when a king ordered spoken tradition to be captured in ink. The first English laws were born. Before this, justice lived in memory alone. It was carried by elders who had learned the price of a broken oath or a spilled drink at a feast. It was measured by honor. It was negotiated beside fires, where families argued over compensation and chiefs finally decided whose dignity was worth how many shillings of silver. Law was personal, flexible, and easily swayed by influence. But Kent, now powerful and prosperous, had grown past the point where memory could hold its identity. It needed structure. It needed something future kings could not distort. It needed writing. Ethelbert, the Judish king, understood this better than anyone. He was not a warlord concerned only with bows and blades. He was a strategist who recognized that true power required recognition, not only from his own warriors, but from foreign courts and the church that stretched across continents. The Jutes had spent years learning that Rome's strength wasn't only legions, it was law. Rome ruled with paperwork tighter than any spear line. If Kent wanted to rise further, it needed the same invisible architecture. So Ethelbert looked beyond his hall and toward the new faith arriving across the sea. The missionaries had come from Rome, not with soldiers, but with books. Augustine and his companions stepped ashore carrying the Vulgate Bible, treatises, and the literacy that made empires possible. They had been sent by Pope Gregory, who believed that converting kings was more efficient than converting farmers. Convert a king, and his people will follow. Ethelbert did not immediately bow to the cross. He observed. For months he listened to Augustine preach in the open air, refusing to meet him indoors, a subtle test in case the monk's words carried magic. The king's caution reflected the Judish balance of openness and defense. Consider every opportunity, but never surrender blindly. His queen, Bertha of the Franks, was already Christian. She had come to Kent with her own priest, Luidhard, granted a restored Roman church to worship in. Christianity had already begun to plant seeds in the royal heart. Ethelbert eventually chose baptism, but historians suspect this was not simply faith, it was also diplomacy. Through Christianity, Kent gained direct ties to Frankish courts, Kent's essential trading partners, literacy, enabling written laws and international correspondence. Prestige, the first English king recognized by the church. Political legitimacy that rivals found difficult to challenge. Shortly after his conversion, the king made a monumental decision. His laws would be written down in Old English, not Latin. This was revolutionary. He was not placing the future in foreign language. He was anchoring law in the tongue of his people, making justice not a privilege of clerics, but knowledge shared among warriors, farmers, and merchants. The earliest surviving manuscripts, copied later into the Textus Rofensis, preserve this legacy. The opening lines of those laws refer to God's domus and worlder domus, the judgments of God and the judgments of men, suggesting a partnership between Christian morality and Germanic social order. These laws reveal astonishing details about Judish society. A priest harmed was paid double the wehrgeld of a freeman. Women's property rights were protected, including widows' inheritance. Compensation for a stolen grinding quern shows value placed on household survival. The king's peace was sacred. A fence within his enclosure cost 12 times more. There is even a clause protecting the rights of foreign merchants, proof that Kent's ports remained internationally active. This was not a tribal code for an isolated people. It was the foundation for a kingdom actively engaged with the wider world. Historians believe that Ethelbert and his advisors studied Frankish Salic law, adapting some aspects to their own customs. But what emerged was uniquely Judish in structure. It preserved their system of honor, yet refined it. The Jutes did not abandon their ways, they evolved them. Picture the scene in Canterbury as this transformation took shape. A scribe bends over parchment, dipping his reed pen into ink made from oak galls and iron salts. He writes carefully, aware that each word carries weight for thousands who will never see this page. Around him, the soft sound of Latin prayers drifts from a nearby chapel, where the incense of incense curls into the rafters. Outside, a glint of sunlight flashes from a warrior's sword. Men train in the courtyard, striking shields with calculated ferocity. The kingdom remains ready for war, but it is now equally prepared for diplomacy. That contrast, pen and sword, prayer and battle, defined Judish power. While other tribes in Britain were still shaped, mainly by warlords and loose councils, Kent now had the blueprint of civilization, written governance. Even the king's own compensation was set an amount so high that it reinforced the sacred boundary between royal blood and everyone else. These laws did more than control behavior. They defined a society, what rank meant, what protection each person deserved, what responsibilities came with wealth, what justice looked like under a king who saw tomorrow coming. No part of daily life was too small to regulate. Injury to a hand used for fighting, damage to a drinking horn, a symbol of social status, the right of a woman to leave a forced marriage, fines for interrupting disputes in the king's hall. Yes, even then people talked over each other. Through these details, we learn more about the Jutes than any chronicler ever intended us to know. These laws are not of mere curiosity. They are the first brick in the long legal road that leads to Magna Carta, common law, and modern Western justice. They prove that English civilization begins with the Jutes. Yet irony hangs over this accomplishment. Though these laws survived, the story of those who created them did not rise with equal permanence. Later, kings copied Ethelbert's laws but did not mention that a Judish hand first laid down the rule book. Chroniclers focused on the victories and expansions of Saxon kings instead. The Jutes, having built the foundation, slowly became invisible as history stacked new floors above them. But look closely and the truth returns. Every courtroom in England contains a faint echo of that hall where the first laws were spoken. Every modern contract carries a trace of the moment justice stopped being memory and became written expectation. Every protection of dignity, whether king, clergy, woman, or merchant, is rooted in choices made in Kent under a Judish crown. Perhaps Ethelbert knew that rulers are often forgotten, but laws endure. So he wrote his legacy not in story or song, but in structure. And because of that, the Jutes continue to rule the bones of English identity, long after their names were buried beneath others. Tonight, we hold their memory in place again, restored not by conquest but by the persistence of truth on parchment. Their kingdom spoke softly through ink, and the world still listened. The power and peril of Kent. With law now written and faith guiding its path, Kent stood proudly at a new crossroads, no longer a land of opportunistic settlers, but a kingdom with identity, ambition, and a voice strong enough to be heard beyond its shores. It was a place where Judish culture had not only survived migration, but had been reshaped in fire and vision into a force capable of influencing the birth of England itself. The halls of Kent were filled with the hum of activity. Warriors trained in open courtyards, the thud of their shields echoing across timber walls. Monks copied scripture by candlelight, preserving not only the new religion but the skills and knowledge that came with it. Traders haggled in bustling markets, exchanging wool, grain, iron tools and fine jewellery for coins and exotic goods from across the channel. The sound of ringing anvils sang of metal turned into power, both symbolic and literal. But beneath that confidence lay a tension as old as the Jutes themselves. With every rise must come a test. The first challenge came not from foreign invaders, but from the growing ambitions of other Germanic kingdoms settling in Britain. Beyond the borders of Kent, new powers were forming, and they were not content to let one kingdom stand tallest. To the West Saxons grew bold, their leaders driven by hunger for southern coasts and fertile farmlands. To the north, Mercia emerged like a silent storm, swallowing territories and forging alliances with cold efficiency. Both kingdoms saw Kent not as a partner in building England, but as a prize to be taken. Kent, however, was clever. It often used diplomacy before war. Marriage alliances became the currency of peace. Kings and nobles negotiated unions between courts, attempting to secure loyalty through blood rather than battle. Ethelbert himself had married a Frankish princess, a move that elevated Kent to a position of international prestige. Yet marriage could only hold off ambition for so long. The first clashes were small: border disputes, revenge raids, fragmented conflicts, but they set a tone. The message was clear: Kent must fight if it wished to remain master of its destiny. And fight it did. The Battle of Wibandun, likely in the late 6th century, was one such moment, where Kentish strength beat back West Saxon intrusion. It wasn't just a victory in battle, it was a declaration to Britain: we are here, we are strong, and we will not surrender. But victories are only chapters, not conclusions. With each generation, new rulers brought new stakes, and alliances shifted like sand. Where diplomacy once soothed tension, deeper competition now ignited it. Even religion, which had once unified Kent to greater powers, now complicated its politics. As Christianity spread across Britain, the Church's influence grew sharper. Bishops advised kings, monasteries held wealth and secrets. The power of persuasion began to rival the power of the spear. When church leaders supported one rival over another, it could tilt the balance of an entire war. Kent, having been the first English kingdom to convert, initially benefited from this relationship. Canterbury stood as the heart of the English Church. Pilgrims travelled there seeking blessings. Letters addressed from the Pope arrived with respect. Yet ironies grew from this blessing. Religious prestige did not guarantee political dominance. Faith spread beyond Kent, and with it, influence shifted. The very institution Kent invited into its halls would later help strengthen the hands of its rivals. Meanwhile, a more subtle danger seeped into Kentish identity: prosperity. For the first time, the Jutes lived in a land where food was stable, trade profitable, and halls comfortable. Children grew up less used to hunger. Warriors enjoyed feasts more often than battles. A sense of security, if not watched carefully, can soften even the strongest people. But the harshest threat, the one that would truly test them, came from the sea. The Vikings arrived like a memory of the Jutes' own ancestral past. Northern raiders driven by hunger, ambition, and fate. They were not kin, they were not allies. They recognized no Judish claim to Britain. To them, Kent was simply rich and undefended. Long ships cut through dark waves before dawn. Villages awoke to screams. Churches that had once celebrated Rome's faith now burned, their bells silenced by fire. Gold became plunder, scholars became slaves. The kingdom that had opened itself to the sea for trade now suffered because of that openness. Kentish warriors fought back with conviction. They recognized the fighting style because their grandfathers had once wielded axes in similar ways on frozen Jutland soil. The battles were brutal, shield edges fraying under the impact of ramming blows, spears snapping as fighters closed into lethal grips. But the Vikings kept coming, and they didn't need to win, only to damage. Every coastal raid weakened Kent's economy. Farmland, once carefully cultivated, fell to ruin when farmers fled inland. Merchants avoided port towns too dangerous to dock in. Foreign allies grew hesitant to risk ships in threatened waters. Even the church suffered grievously. Canterbury itself was sacked more than once, its sacred relics stolen, its monks slaughtered or ransomed. The Jutes found themselves trapped between two pressures. Saxon and Mercian expansion inland, Viking terror from the sea. A kingdom can withstand one storm, but two storms from opposite fronts? That is the tragedy of Kent. Still, Kent did not collapse at once. Its rulers negotiated, fought, adapted. They continued issuing law codes, proof they were still governing, still believing in the kingdom's future. Kings like Hlothere, Edric and Witred preserved the legal and spiritual legacy that Ethelbert had founded. Their reigns proved that Kent remained a force for generations, refusing to surrender identity even as borders tightened. But politics is a game of momentum, and Kent slowed just as Wessex accelerated. When Offa of Mercia entered the scene, he viewed Kent not as equal, but as subordinate. Mercia imposed its own rulers, reshaped governance, and treated Kent as a trophy to strengthen the Midlands' growing empire. Then Wessex, under kings like Egbert and Ethelwulf, overtook Mercia, and with it, Kent. No grand final battle sealed Kent's fate. Instead, authority shifted gradually, quietly. The Judish royal line faded like a torch burning low. And what was, lost politically, survived culturally. Through all of this, the people of Kent, the majority still of Judish descent, remained. Their accents influenced Old English. Their artifacts continued to be buried in the soil. Their children grew into future leaders, monks, merchants, and farmers of a New England. The Jutes did something most ancient peoples could not. They endured absorption without erasure. Their name faded, but their influence spread. Their justice became English justice. Their diplomacy became English diplomacy. Their Christianity became English Christianity. A kingdom that once seemed destined to lead Britain found itself gradually woven into the fabric of a greater nation, not as the conquerors of tomorrow, but as the foundation upon which tomorrow was built. Tonight, as we sit in the quiet of history's long night, Kent looks less like a fallen kingdom and more like a seed, one that rooted deep enough to grow into something larger than itself. The Jutes may have lost their crown, but their values became the metal from which England forged its future. The halls of Kent stand silent in ruins now, walls swallowed by earth and ivy. But listen closely. The stones still whisper justice, faith, and the strength of a people who once shaped a nation. Their rise gave England direction, their law gave it structure, their endurance gave it soul. The story is not how Kent ended someday, but how England began. The Isle of Wight, the last Judish stronghold. When the Jutes first looked upon the Isle of Wight from their ships, they saw more than land. They saw a sanctuary, a place where a kingdom might be built without the constant shadow of rival clans pressing from every direction. The island lay like a shield between the mainland and the open sea, with chalk-white cliffs rising as if carved to guard a new future. The Jutes named it not merely as territory, but as home. Unlike Kent, where politics meant negotiation with Britons and competition with other Germanic settlers, the Isle of Wight was unclaimed and unforgiving, and therefore full of possibility. Forests stretched deep, filled with boar and deer. The coastline curled into natural harbours where ships could shelter. The soil was rich enough to feed families and thick enough to resist the storms of winter. Fish thrived in waters that sparkled beneath long summer sunsets. It was the kind of land promised in stories, a place where fortune could be made through courage, skill, and community. So the Jutes moved here with their families, livestock, and the memories of Jutland still echoing in their hearts. They built long houses in familiar fashion. The timber skeleton raised first, then walls woven with wattle and daub, and thatched roofs sloping low to break the wind's force. These homes were not just dwellings. They were ancestral statements. We are still ourselves. Inside those halls, warmth came from camaraderie as much as from fires. Children played with carved wooden animals while warriors boasted over hunts and battles. Women tended not only to household tasks but to the shaping of community, weaving, healing, maintaining memory through stories and song. The Isle of Wight was not merely an extension of Kentish rule. It was a Judish world apart. Archaeologists today uncover the traces of that confidence. At cemeteries like Bochum Down and Chessel Down, high-status burials reveal warriors laid to rest with swords longer than those typically found in other Anglo-Saxon graves. The blades were pattern-welded, shimmering with twisted iron grains that symbolized power and craftsmanship. Shield bosses rested beside them, decorated so intricately that even in rusted survival they still command respect. Women's graves, too, speak boldly. Brooches of bronze and sometimes silver were shaped into square-headed forms, stamped with spirals and animal guardians, a style unique to Judish influence. These artifacts were not mere decoration, they were identity, portable genealogy, and protection for the soul. Beads of amber, jet, and rare glass were strung and buried lovingly, suggestions of long-distance trade that connected this small island to markets far beyond the horizon. Even the smallest objects, tools, weaving weights, pendants, whisper the same message. The Jutes thrived here, and they intended to stay. But identity does not remain untouched forever. Christianity had already entered Kent, and though it spread more slowly to the island, monks eventually crossed the narrow, Solent waters. They carried crosses instead of spears, words instead of threats. Conversion came gradually, sometimes through belief, sometimes through diplomacy, occasionally, perhaps, through pressure from Christian Kentish rulers who wished for religious unity across their domains. Yet the old gods were stubborn on Wight. Traces of earlier rituals lingered long after conversion. Cremation burials persisted in corners where the church's influence had not yet reached. Offerings were placed in graves to appease unseen guardians. Even as the cross took root, some families buried amulets alongside it, unwilling to forget the spirits who had guided their ancestors across the cold sea. For generations, the island balanced between two spiritual worlds. In that balance lay its unique cultural strength. But the world beyond Wight continued to shift, and kingdoms farther inland were no longer ignoring the sea-bound community. Ambitious rulers of Wessex, peering across the waves, recognised that control over the Isle of Wight meant command over shipping lanes and coastal defence. To hold the island was to safeguard the southern gate of Britain. In the year 686 AD, the storm came. Cedwalla of Wessex, a king defined by fire, conquest and faith, set his sights on the island. His army arrived not as mercenaries or negotiators, but as conquerors with a mission to claim Wight and extinguish its independence. The Jutes fought bravely with the fury of a people defending their last true domain. But Wessex had numbers, resources and momentum. When the battles ended, the consequences were brutal. This was not peaceful assimilation, it was suppression. According to the Venerable Bede, Cedwalla vowed to exterminate the island's original inhabitants and replace them with his own followers. Whether this genocide fully occurred is debated by historians. Archaeology suggests many Jutes survived, but the attempt alone reveals how deeply threatening their existence was to Wessex authority. The royal family of Wight, once proud symbols of Judish autonomy, disappeared from the historical record. Some were likely killed, others forced into baptism as symbolic surrender. Lands were seized, monasteries were established to stamp Christian dominance more fully than persuasion ever could. Pagan temples were dismantled or converted, and traces of Judish sovereignty were systematically erased from the visible landscape. But peoples do not disappear simply because their rulers fall silent. The Jutes of Wight survived, not as a named kingdom, but as families who adapted. Their customs blended into Saxon rule, yet their ancestry continued in blood, in agricultural patterns, in burial traditions that shifted but never broke. They lived on through marriages, through generations of children whose great-grandparents once ruled an island. Even their language left footprints, tiny clues in place names and dialects that puzzle linguists today. Soil remembers what governments forget. For centuries after the conquest, the Isle of Wight retained hints of its distinct past. Its people were often viewed with suspicion, different enough to be noticed, similar enough to be governed. Folklore emerged, stories of old kings, warrior ancestors, and spirits who watched the coasts. These tales may be embellished by time, but they carry emotional truth, a longing to remember the days when the island shaped its own destiny. Today, modern researchers dig deeper into these memories. DNA analysis reveals Scandinavian lineage stronger here than in many other parts of England. A genetic echo of Jutland's cold wind. Isotope studies confirm continental origins of early settlers. Every new excavation brings up artifacts whose design refuses to fit neatly into Saxon narratives. The Jutes are emerging from the ground once more. The Isle of Wight was the last pure Judish kingdom, the last place where their culture stood alone, undefeated, unblurred. It endured longer than Kent's independence and died more violently, which may be why its story was most forcefully silenced. Yet even silence cannot seal a people forever. The island's cliffs still face the sea in quiet determination, as if remembering the ships that once brought hope. The ancient fields still hide fragments of brooches that glinted proudly upon the chests of Judish nobles. The graves still hold warriors who believed eternity lay just beyond the Solent's shifting tides. History tried to bury them. The earth keeps pushing them back to the surface. Kent gave the Jutes a crown. Wight gave them a refuge. Both gave England its first foundations. When we speak of the Isle of Wight today, its beauty, its legends, its ancient past, we are walking through a kingdom that once mattered far more than the chronicles allowed us to remember. The Jutes did not lose themselves here. They defended their identity until the very last moment. And in that defiance they preserved something eternal, a memory that refuses to drown. Between two realms, the Judish soul in spiritual. Between two realms, the Judish soul in spiritual transition. Before crosses stood upon Kentish hills, before Latin prayers echoed through Canterbury's stone halls, the Jutes already believed the world was crowded, not by people, but by powers. Their gods were not distant monarchs in the clouds. They lived close to the earth, in thunder, in harvest, in the creak of a ship's hull against wind-torn waves. A Judish warrior never rode alone. Unseen ancestors walked at his back. A mother, laying her child to sleep beside the hearth, felt protective spirits hovering like warm breath in the shadows. Faith was not a Sunday ritual. It was oxygen. They worshipped at sacred groves where oaks thick with moss were believed to house the wisdom of gods older than memory. They carved runic charms into objects carried on journeys or into the afterlife. Fire and iron were divine gifts. Fire symbolizing life and renewal. Iron symbolizing strength and fate. Every feast, every birth, every battle was a shared contract between the human world and the unseen. This spiritual confidence crossed with them over the sea. When the first Judish settlers stepped onto Britain's shores, they brought not only weapons and tools, but gods. Shrines were rebuilt. Rites followed unchanged. Pagan law guided truth. To break an oath was not merely a crime against society, but a violation of cosmic order. Yet Britain was a land of many metamorphoses. Roman Christianity, once a distant influence, still lingered in some hearts and halls. On the Isle of Thanet, in Kent's early years, the Church of St. Martin, restored by Queen Bertha, glowed like a candle in a pagan night. There, Christian hymns were already rising while warriors still sacrificed to Odin beneath the moon. The spiritual world of the Jutes was about to collide with a new and deeply persuasive force. When Augustine arrived in 597, he did not storm temples or burn idols. He came with caution because Judish belief was not a weak or confused tradition. It was coherent, proud, and anchored to ancestry. Conversion here would require patience, diplomacy, and strategy. He began where influence lived, with King Ethelbert. The conversion of a king was not simply personal salvation, it was geopolitical genius. The church knew that if a ruler embraced Christianity, his nobles would follow, fearing isolation more than divine wrath. But Ethelbert was not a man easily swayed. He insisted Augustine preach outdoors, not inside a hall where enchantments were believed strongest. He listened carefully. He measured not the resurrection story, but the opportunity wrapped inside it. Christianity promised writing and record-keeping, international alliances with the Franks and Rome, the political prestige of belonging to a vast, unified faith, a single God above kings, making a king's power appear divinely ordained. But the Jutes did not leap into conversion like naive believers. They tested Christianity against the weight of their traditions, and so began one of history's most graceful spiritual negotiations. Christian churches rose, but not always on new sites. Missionaries often built them directly atop pagan holy grounds, merging the sacred spaces rather than erasing them. The message was subtle. Your gods watched here once. Now this place belongs to the new God. Landscapes retained spiritual memory even as symbols changed. Burials provide the clearest archaeological evidence of the transition. It didn't happen overnight. Early Christian graves still included jewelry, weapons, and charms, insurance for the afterlife. Even decades after conversion, mothers hid protective amulets among the garments of the dead, a private rebellion against doctrine. The church tolerated these compromises. Better a Christian burial with a pagan talisman than no Christian burial at all. identity changed slowly through habits. Cross pendants replaced animal spirit amulets. Latin prayers softened the voices once raised in old incantations. The east-west body alignment in graves symbolized hope in resurrection. Chiefs built chapels beside their halls, blending power with piety. This coexistence lasted longer in the Isle of Wight, where the Jutes clung to their old gods as one clings to cherished memory when facing loss. Even when baptism became common, secret rituals likely continued in forests and homes. Faith does not vanish because a ruler changes his mind. Belief must evolve where emotion allows. Yet Christianity brought new emotional comforts the old religion could not match. Forgiveness for wrongdoing rather than lifelong shame. Eternal life offered to the humble, not only the heroic. A structured community that cared for widows, children, and the poor. These promises spoke gently but powerfully to those weary of warrior demands. Still, the old gods did not leave peacefully. The legends of the wild hunt, of spectral riders sweeping through skies, persisted for centuries in Kentish folklore, a likely echo of Odin and his heroic dead. Tales of elves and land spirits endured in rural superstitions. Even Christian scribes occasionally complained that villagers continued to leave food for sprites in gardens and barns. Belief systems do not replace each other. They merge, like rivers, meeting and forming deeper waters. By the time Kent was fully Christian, its Christianity was no longer purely Roman, it was Judish Christianity, shaped by the northern spirit rather than conquered by it. Its characteristics were unique. A strong warrior saint tradition, valor aligned with holiness, honor preserved within new moral codes, feast traditions transformed into Christian festivals, churches acting as communal halls as much as sacred places. Instead of reversing their identity, the Jutes allowed faith to give it new armor. But there was a cost. Christian chronicles, while preserving literacy and education, also controlled the narrative. They wrote English history from the perspective of those in power in later centuries. West Saxon kings. The Jutes became characters in someone else's story. Pagan traditions were labelled backward. Judish victories were minimized in comparison to Wessex achievements. Chroniclers praised later rulers as founders of unity, barely acknowledging Kent's earlier supremacy. In other words, Christianity preserved the Jutes' achievements, while accidentally burying their name. The transition was spiritual, but also political. And yet, even in forgetting, their influence thrived. Canterbury became the centre of English Christianity. Monks educated leaders who shaped the emerging kingdom. Written law spread literacy and governance. Art evolved into illuminated manuscripts blending pagan patterns and sacred meaning. The Jutes may have adopted a new heaven, but they kept their soul. The old gods faded into story, not defeat. The new God rose, not by conquest, but by conversation. Faith became a bridge, not a battlefield. There is a quiet strength in such a transformation. History often remembers loud conversions, bloody purges, idols smashed. Kent's conversion was different. It was negotiation, not domination. The Jutes understood something vital. Identity is not threatened by change unless it refuses to grow. Their legacy was not to cling to the past like a relic. Their legacy was to shape the future and remain within it. The cross that stands over England today carries the imprint of the Judish spirit, a faith accepted not out of fear, but from a pragmatic, resilient, and deeply human desire to belong in a new world without losing the memory of the old. And because they chose transformation over resistance, England was born not in darkness, but in dialogue, the storm of iron. When the Vikings came for Kent, The sea that once carried the Jutes into greatness returned with a new hunger. It no longer brought opportunity, trade, and kin from across the water. It brought a shadow, carved into long ships that slid silently across dawn-lit swells like wolves stalking an unsuspecting herd. Their hulls were sleek, shallow, built not for settlement, but for speed, for the violent theft of other people's futures. Their prows were carved into dragons, or snarling beasts meant to terrify, and the men inside the Vikings had eyes trained to watch coastlines with predatory calculation. To them, Kent was not a kingdom of laws and learning. It was a treasure chest left unwatched. It began quietly. Fishermen spotted unfamiliar ships far from shore and assumed they were merchants or wanderers. But fishermen do not expect death to come wearing iron helmets and carrying round shields studded with rivets. One morning's tide would wash up planks and splintered oars, and no survivors to tell what happened. Kent, prosperous and confident, was an irresistible target. In 851 AD, the storm announced itself in full. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it plainly. A fleet of 350 Viking ships struck the south coast, but ink cannot capture the terror of a single day that changes a civilization. Churches burned so fiercely that smoke blackened the summer sky. Markets collapsed into screams as warriors with two-handed axes tore through stalls. Rich monasteries, filled with golden relics and books painstakingly copied by monks, became loot piles. The Jutes had once owned the shoreline. Now they died on it. Swords clashed with axes, spears shattered against shields. The defenders fought not as frightened peasants, but as descendants of those who founded Kent through conquest and strategy. Yet bravery does not always counter overwhelming numbers. What made Viking attacks so devastating was their adaptability. They struck where defenders were weak. They attacked quickly, retreating before armies could gather. They returned repeatedly, learning the land better each raid. They used waterways as roads. No fortress wall could stop Kent, with its wealth and ports, was like honey to hornets. The monks at Canterbury tried to protect their greatest treasure, knowledge, locking library doors and praying walls would hold. Some attempted to bury manuscripts beneath the floor. Others fled into forests with reliquaries strapped to their backs. But metal clanged against sacred gates, and those prayers often ended in blood. Scriptorium benches were overturned, candles and parchment ignited, words, centuries of them, curled into ash as the sky filled with the smell of burnt ink. The Vikings did not hate Christianity, they simply valued silver, and the church stored silver abundantly. Faith had no power against fire. The Jutes had always been prepared for war, but this was a new kind of enemy, one who did not want land, treaties, or terms. They wanted plunder and fear, and both were easily gained, and they kept returning. In 1865 AD, Vikings established a long-term base on Thanet, anchoring themselves on land that once belonged to the very first Jutish settlers. The invaders wintered there comfortably, a sign they planned not just to raid, but to rule. The old proud coastline of Jutish arrival had become the coastline of Jutish defeat. Still, Kent was not weak. Even in crisis, it showed remarkable resilience. Kings negotiated ransom payments, raised armies, sought alliances, and rebuilt towns in defiance of despair. After each attack, families repaired halls from scorched beams, re-roofed barns, blessed fields gone black with ash, and planted again because survival is its own argument against conquest. But every kingdom has a threshold. Every storm has waves that break the strongest cliffs. The Viking devastation came just as political pressure from inland mounted mercilessly. Mercia, led by ambitious rulers like Offa, sought to dominate southeastern Britain. Kent, caught between Viking fury from the sea and Mercian authority from the land, found itself squeezed into dependency. Mercian overlordship eventually crumbled, but when it did, Wessex rose even stronger. Wessex, the kingdom that would one day birth Alfred the Great, saw Kent as necessary ground in a larger campaign to control all of England. Wessex offered protection from Vikings, but protection always comes at a cost. Kent began losing its freedom not through a dramatic battle, but through a series of adjustments. Wessex nobles were appointed over Kentish holdings. Laws began reflecting West Saxon priorities. Royal charters replaced Judish authority silently. The Archbishop of Canterbury increasingly answered to Wessex crowns. The independence of centuries slipped away not as chaos, but as administration. But here lies the cruel irony. The Jutes had once maneuvered themselves into power through the weaknesses of Roman Britain. Now their own vulnerabilities allowed others to repeat the same strategy. History loops. The sea brings fortune, then returns for payment. What makes Kent's fall most tragic is that its strength became its downfall. Its wealth attracted raiders. Its coast made it easy to attack. Its diplomacy tied it to powerful interests. Its faith connected it to continental politics. Its innovation made it too valuable to ignore. Even so, Kent never surrendered its pride. In resistance, it discovered its final form of strength: adaptation. This is why the Jutes did not disappear, even as their royalty did. Ordinary people, the farmers, sailors, potters, weavers, continued life as they always had. Fishing where their ancestors fished, farming land their grandfathers cleared, raising children who carried Judish blood, crafting brooches with familiar patterns, burying the dead with quiet dignity. They woke each morning not wondering which kingdom they belonged to, but how many hours remained until darkness returned. Nations change, politics crumbles, people endure. Even in the worst years, the Jutes clung to a quiet truth. So long as the family survives, the culture remains alive. And survive they did. Their story does not end with conquest. It endures in transformation. When the storm finally eased in future generations, Kent emerged altered, but alive. The Vikings, once feared, invaders eventually became settlers themselves in other regions, merging bloodlines and customs just as the Jutes once had in Kent. In the mingling of all these peoples, Jutes, Saxons, Britons and Norse, England was shaped. The Jutes were not erased, they were woven tighter into the new pattern. Still, if you stand today upon the Kentish coast as dawn breaks when the wind is cold and the sea grey and unmerciful, you can imagine the moment when the first Viking ships darkened the horizon. Imagine a black silhouette sliding from the mist, not knowing whether it carried kin or death. Imagine the courage of those who stood ready on the beach, weapons in hand, knowing their children watched behind them. Imagine a world changing faster than any sword could stop. The sea gave the Jutes a kingdom. It took that kingdom back in fire and fear, but the Jutes endured in the very heart of the land they helped build. History measures kingdoms by conquests. Legacy measures people by survival. By that measure, the Jutes did not lose. They simply became part of something larger. No, and the name of that something was England. The earth refused to forget. Centuries passed and the kingdom that the Jutes built faded into political memory. Kings changed names, crowns changed heads, borders shifted like restless tides. But while written chronicles forgot, the earth, as always, remembered. Every field, every burial mound, every riverbank in Kent and the Isle of Wight hides small truths that have waited patiently for hands to return and listen. Archaeologists kneeling in muddy trenches today uncover what history tried to bury. Pieces of metal, fragments of pottery, outlines of ancient halls. Each one whispering, "We were here, we mattered." Objects lie, stones remain silent. But a patient mind can learn to interpret their silence. The Jutes left behind one thing that death could not rot: craft. Their metalwork, recovered from graves and settlement sites, remains extraordinary even in rust. Bronze brooches bear geometric motifs that are unmistakably Jutish, angular lines intersecting like runes of identity. The beloved square-headed brooch, bold and ornate, became one of the most iconic artifacts of early Kentish culture. Its design travelled far beyond Britain, found in Scandinavia and Frankish lands, a sign of prestige and exchange. Weapons were not merely tools of war, they were messages. Pattern-welded swords, shimmering with braided iron, famed for strength. Shields adorned with engraved bosses that spoke of the warrior's rank. Spearheads elongated in distinct Jutish style, some swords contain garnet inlays, a precious import, glowing like drops of frozen fire. To hold such a sword was to hold a lineage on your hip. Burials expand the story even further. At cemeteries such as Ossengel in Kent, bodies were buried with astonishingly rich goods: glass vessels from the continent, amber beads from the Baltic, silver clasps, gold filigree. One necklace contained over 200 beads, each sourced from a different region, proof of a trading network that stretched farther than any scribe dared to record. These embellishments were not vanity, they were worldview. To the Jutes, wealth travelled with you into the afterlife. Jewellery was memory, weapons were status. Grave goods ensured that ancestors arrived in the next realm as confidently as they lived in this one, and children too were buried with care. Tiny brooches, miniature toys, suggesting that even the smallest among them had a spiritual identity worth honouring. Love is a readable thing in archaeology. Gentle hands that once placed objects beside a beloved child, but not all artifacts celebrate life. Some mark fear. In several Kentish graves, archaeologists have discovered stakes driven across the legs or stones weighing down the chest, signs of concern that the dead might rise again. Perhaps disease frightened the living into believing restless spirits would return seeking vengeance. Such rites expose the spiritual tension during conversion, fear of both old gods and new sins. What we know of everyday life also emerges from soil and shadow. Loom weights hint at textile skills that made Kent's cloth highly prized. Animal bones reveal farming innovations. Pig rearing thrived here. Recovered quernstones tell of households grinding grain daily. Self-sufficient, communal. Hearth remains show that cooking was central. Warmth, nourishment, gathering, homes themselves carried stories. Remnants of sunken featured buildings, small, semi-underground workshops, appear at many Jutish settlements, likely used for weaving, smithing, or winter storage. These spaces symbolized hands-on resilience. Above them rose great halls, long timber structures where chieftains hosted feasts, settled disputes, and negotiated futures. These early Kentish halls were ancestors of the English manor house and the medieval Great Hall in castles. A lineage of architecture stretches from Jutish beams to Norman stone. Then there is art, the poetry carved into the practical. Decorative motifs on metalwork feature interlaced beasts, serpents, wolves, and bird forms. The style would evolve into what historians admire as Kentish prestige art, influencing later Anglo-Saxon masterpieces. The Sutton Hoo treasures from East Anglia, though not Jutish themselves, show clear artistic kinship, cultural conversations across the Germanic world. Coins tell another tale, seductive proof of Kent's economic intelligence. Under kings like Eadbald and Ecgbert of Kent, silver coins were minted bearing inscriptions that proclaimed sovereignty in a medium everyone understood: money. Some bear tiny crosses, marking faith and commerce married together. Though Kent eventually fell under Wessex, its minting tradition became part of the wider English economy. Every coin struck in later centuries owes something to this early Judish example. Language, too, carries invisible legacy. Certain Old English dialectal quirks in the southeast show Judish roots, distinct from Saxon and Anglian phonetics. Place names, like Sethampton, Chatham, and White itself, preserve meanings in whispers across time. Even genetics speaks. DNA extracted from teeth and bones reveals continental origins, intermarriages, resilience of families who stayed close to their ancestral settlements long after politics shifted above them. But perhaps the most extraordinary form of survival is found not in weapons or jewelry, but in writing. Many of the earliest English texts, Christian sermons, administrative records, missionary letters, were produced in Canterbury, capital of the Judish kingdom. These documents shaped literacy in Britain. Every English word written today sits atop the Jude's decision to embrace the pen as well as the sword. And then there are illuminated manuscripts, pages of scripture adorned with subtle patterns that resemble early Judish art. Even religion carried their signature. So why, after shaping so much of England's identity, are the Judes barely whispered about in schoolbooks? Because politics chooses memory. The West Saxons, who later unified England, wrote the dominant history. Their scribes praised their own lineage and victories. Kent's earlier achievements became mere chapters in a narrative of Wessex glory. The Judes, once leaders of law and faith, became supporting characters. But the archaeological record does not play favourites. It reveals things as they are, not as chroniclers wish them to be. Every year, new excavations expand the story. At Fingalsham, a grave containing a warrior with gold inlaid sword fittings. At Sara, brooches so fine they challenge any museum display. At Buckland Dover, dental isotopes confirming continental childhood origins. At Deal, shield bosses that display masterful metal craft. At Hazelborough, traces of feasting pits and communal gatherings. Each discovery is a fragment of a puzzle finally being reassembled. To walk in Kent is to step upon artifact, a brooch beneath one bootprint, a warrior's grave beneath another. These lands are not simply English, they are Judish English, and the Isle of Wight, its soil continues to return beads, tiny, fragile stones that once rested against healing hearts. Coastal erosion reveals bones that had slept for 1,500 years. Even the place name Hampshire hints at the frontier role this region once played, the edge of a Judish sphere. The earth presses forward reminders refusing amnesia, because neither culture nor identity truly die. They become part of something larger, submerged but never lost. The Judes, though conquered politically, conquered time. Their art lives, their language survives, their genes walk modern streets, their laws remain the roots of justice. What the world forgot, the soil preserved. So, tonight, as the wind moves over Kent's quiet fields, imagine what lies beneath. A brooch waiting for light, a sword waiting for a name, a story waiting to be reawakened. The earth remembers, and through that remembrance, the Judes rise again. Bones, words again. Bones, words, and the law that refused to die. That refused to die. When a kingdom loses its crown, the world assumes its story ends. But the Judes no longer needed crowns. They had left their legacy in the two places history can never truly erase the body and the written word. Long after the last Judish king walked the courts of Kent, their descendants continued to live, love, celebrate, grieve, and die upon the land they had shaped. And because the earth keeps what we leave behind, modern science is giving the Jutes back their voice. It begins with bones. In cemeteries across Kent and the Isle of Wight, archaeologists uncover skeletons preserved in chalky soil. Bones still etched with lives that once bent to ploughs, carried shields, or held children against their hearts. These bones tell truths that no chronicle preserved. Strong leg muscles revealed by the thickness of femurs show people accustomed to walking long distances over rugged terrain. Teeth with ridged wear tell of grinding grain, the tough bread of survival. Damage from healed fractures hints at warriors who survived battle and returned to feast afterward. But bones hold deeper secrets, those told not by shape but by chemistry. When a person drinks water and eats food as a child, their teeth absorb elements from the landscape. Those elements stay locked in enamel forever. Scientists call this isotope analysis, and it has proven something astonishing. Many buried in early Kentish graves were not born in Britain. They carried chemical signatures matching Denmark and Schleswig-Holstein. They were Jutes by blood and birthplace. Others in the same cemeteries were born in Britain, proof of intermarriage and cultural fusion across the first generations. This mixture did not weaken the Jutes, it ensured their survival. DNA research has traced lineages showing Scandinavian markers more concentrated in southeast England than anywhere else in the country. Even today, people living in Kent and Wight unknowingly carry the memory of Jutland in every heartbeat. Science has brought the Jutes home again, yet bones alone cannot explain how a people shapes a nation. For that we turn to words. In the quiet, ink-scented rooms of Canterbury, scribes once leaned over parchment, copying Latin texts by candlelight. They did not always understand the Latin perfectly, but the act alone was revolutionary. Literacy spreading through a kingdom born of warriors. Soon, they began writing not just Holy Scripture but English, shaping a language that did not yet know itself. These scribes belonged to a legacy created by King Ethelbert, who had insisted laws be written in the tongue of his people. Because of them, English did not die in saga or superstition. It thrived in ink. Documents like charters granting land to monasteries, marriage agreements securing alliances, court rulings detailing compensation and conflict, prayers written phonetically for new converts, all preserved the voice of a culture in transition. Among the most important survivals sits a manuscript created long after Ethelbert, yet carrying his earliest words, the Textus Rufensis, written in the 1120s but preserving Kent's 6th and 7th century laws, the first laws ever written in English. Why did they survive? Because later kings recognized their usefulness, even if they forgot their origin. Those laws did more than dictate fines. They shaped society. The protection of women during marriage and widowhood, the rights of merchants in foreign trade, clear compensation for wounds and crimes, a structured hierarchy of responsibility. Even when Kent fell to Mercia and later to Wessex, its laws remained the template. Kings like Wihtred refined them. Wessex rulers incorporated them. Alfred the Great studied them when building his own legal reforms. Thus, every time an English court governs fairness over revenge, the Jutes live again. But the written record preserves more than law. It preserves faith, and with it, culture. Canterbury rose not as just a city, but as an anchor of the English Church. Even the Synod of Whitby, the great meeting where northern and southern Christianity united under one practice, depended on the intellectual strength that first grew in Kent. Monks became diplomats, priests became historians. The pen replaced the spear as the primary tool of influence. Still, the Jutes never lost the warrior memory entirely. Even the illuminated manuscripts of Canterbury hold hints of older gods. Interlaced animal forms, spirals resembling ancient charms, geometric patterns older than Christianity itself. Their identity did not collapse. It wove itself into the new world. Consider a single brooch excavated at Fingalsham, where the body of a noble warrior lay buried for 400 years. On that brooch is a tiny figure, arms spread wide, flanked by ravens. Scholars debate, is this Odin, ruler of the Norse gods? Or is it Christ reinterpreted through a northern soul? That question is the Jutes. They blended tradition into transformation, refusing either to die. Even linguistics holds their memory. Certain southeastern dialects preserve word roots that likely originated in Judish settlements. Rural folklore includes customs aligning with pre-Christian Germanic rites, like charm bowls in farmhouses to keep spirits from barns, or blessing wells linked to older pagan water rituals. Memory survived in habit. Habit survived in generations. Generations survived in blood. The Jutes were successful not because they conquered Britain by force, but because they understood change. They allowed their gods to whisper behind their new prayers. They allowed their laws to evolve with new ideals. They allowed their culture to shape England quietly, from the roots upward. Most medieval powers left scars. The Jutes left foundations. Think of how England views justice. Not endless cycles of vengeance, but compensation and accountability. Think of how England built identity. Through literacy and law, not only conquest. Think of where English Christianity began. Not in powerful Wessex, but in the Judish kingdom of Kent. The bones speak of origins, the words speak of continuity, but it is law that speaks of foresight. Ethelbert could never have known how the future would twist. He could never have predicted that his people's name would fade from royal chronicles. Yet he ensured that the principles of his society would become the spine of a new nation. Every English crown afterward rests on the foundation he set. When lawyers argue in courts today, when judges weigh fairness over fury, they follow the path Kent carved. Even parliamentary governance, centuries later, would unknowingly walk the same philosophical road. The Jutes did not survive as a people in name. They survived as the framework of English civilization, and perhaps that is the greatest type of immortality, to become so essential that history forgets to point directly at you. But archaeology remembers, language remembers, law remembers, and now, once again, we remember. The founders England forgot. There are stories that kingdoms tell and stories that kingdoms bury. When you ask most people where England began, they speak of Saxons with their war banners and Angles with their shipborne migrations. They point to Alfred the Great or to the Normans who carved stone into castles. They talk of empires and monarchs, revolutions and parliaments. But history is rarely honest. It elevates the loud and erases the quiet. The truth is this: England began a lifetime earlier in a place far closer to the shore and far nearer to the roots of Germanic Britain. It began in Kent, with the Jutes, not a footnote to Saxon history, not a mere tribe swallowed by time, but the first architects of English law, governance and faith, and yet their name is now spoken softly, if at all. How do great founders become forgotten? The answer lies not in failure, but in success. The Jutes were too effective at merging into the nation they helped build. They shaped English culture so deeply that it became difficult to see where their contribution ended and England began. Their story became invisible because it became foundation. In the land they claimed, Kent's earliest rulers built a structure of cooperation and diplomacy unique in its era. Warrior aristocrats of the Jutes stood not as tyrants but as mediators, men who understood that a kingdom dies if its people break apart inside it. Their power rested not only on spears but on something far sturdier: trust in law. Ethelbert's Code, the first English legal text, is not a dusty curiosity. It is where the concept of rights entered Britain. It replaced vengeance with order, chaos with consequence. Even the lowest had worth, measurable by justice. That idea survived empires. That idea built courts. That idea made kings accountable. It was Judish. From Kent, the written word spread like dawn across Britain. Scripture, charters, education, all seeded in a Christian centre raised by a people who once prayed to the sky. The oldest English libraries began here. The shaping of English Christianity began here. The conversion of a continent began here. It was Judish. The Jutes introduced architecture that inspired the future, sturdy halls that evolved into the grand medieval manors. They established trade routes that outlasted their kings: amber, cloth, iron, jewellery. The first economy coordinated on English soil. It was Judish. They integrated Britons into their society rather than extinguishing them, forging hybrid identities rather than destruction. It was Judish. Most significantly, they showed how a culture survives transformation. They allowed their identity to flow, not shatter. That is why the Jutes did not vanish when Kent lost its crown. They transmitted themselves through families who refused to leave their ancestral fields. Place names still whispered in the land. Dialects curled inside the English tongue. Bones beneath the chalk waiting to speak. Laws that flow through every courtroom. Art that echoes in museums. Faith that radiated from Canterbury to the world. They built the first chapter in the Book of England. Others took credit for writing the novel. So the next time someone says the English descend from Saxons and Angles, correct them gently. No, England descends from the Jutes too. Because when Hengist and Horsa made landfall in the 5th century, the first policymakers of England did not wait. They built kingdoms, not raids. They planted roots, not flags. Where others saw opportunity, they saw home. And from that home grew a people whose identity would never again be singular, because they taught England how to absorb, not just conquer. Saxon, Briton, Frank, Dane, all found room inside a society the Jutes helped shape. Their invisibility is their triumph. To be forgotten is sometimes proof of how deeply you changed the world. But tonight, we give memory back its voice. We remember the blacksmith hammering sparks into swords that would outlive him. The potter etching geometric inheritance into clay. The sailor studying wind like scripture, steering destiny toward new shores. The mother sewing beads into a doll so a child never faced the afterlife alone. The chieftain sitting in torchlight, debating whether justice or strength defined a leader. The monk scratching the first English words of law into parchment by candlelight. They each planted seeds, and the world grew around them. If you walk along the Kentish coast at dusk, you may hear it. The waves repeating the sound of oars from long ago. The breeze through fields still follows ancient property lines. The bells of Canterbury ring above ground that once hosted pagan prayer. Past and present touch hands there. The Jutes are not ghosts. They are the earth beneath England's story. They are the law that governs fairness. They are the faith that began literacy. They are the culture that saw unity as strength. They are the heart of a nation too vast to remember every builder. We study them not out of nostalgia, but because identity is incomplete without origin. England may never carve statues of Judish kings. History may never rewrite scrolls to elevate their name. But recognition has returned, quietly, strongly, through archaeology, science, and rediscovered texts. The Jutes have emerged from silence. And so we close this journey with the truth. Before England knew its name, before kings ruled beyond the Thames, before prayers were written in English, the Jutes shaped the island's destiny, and though centuries sought to forget them, time has carried their legacy forward, in law, in language, in blood. The founders England forgot were here all along, and now we remember.